Good afternoon. Clinical trials? Anyone here involved in clinical trials in their organization? I met a few folks during the little break at the very beginning. So I know there's a kind of a mix in the room. And so for the next half hour, as your lunchtime entertainment, I'm gonna try and queue up a little bit of a core challenge that's pervasive across just about all clinical development programs, and that's a challenge around patient recruitment. But I'm going to bring it back to this theme of healthcare provider interactions, because one of the most significant bottlenecks to our success in recruiting patients in studies may be our lack of engagement with healthcare providers. And I'm drawing a distinction we'll talk a little bit about between the role that a physician may play as an investigator in a study versus the role that he or she may play as a treating physician, a healthcare provider, whether in the community or at an academic research institution. There's a bit of a distinction, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll share hopefully a couple of provocative things that we, either in my organization or we across the industry, are trying to do there. But I'll be really interested in the feedback of the know-it-alls in the room, the category 3 from what you were just introducing, but also the folks that are a little more green to that whole space around HCP interactions, because I want to learn from you. I'm not an expert on HCP interactions. My expertise is around clinical trials and clinical development, and so I'm really excited to learn from the folks in this room. So there was some data from the National Cancer Institute a couple of months ago that there are some 8,000 cancer trials right now that are actively enrolling, and yet consistently in oncology, less than 5%, and some statistics point to 2 to 4% of cancer patients actively participate in clinical trials. Despite all of that substrate, all of that opportunity, all of that supply, the number of patients that participate is abysmal. And if you think that it's that low in oncology, start to extrapolate what it looks like in cardiovascular and metabolic disease, or fill in the blank for indication. Because if that's an area with unmet need and patients that may seem, quite honestly, at times desperate for new alternatives, imagine what it looks like in your diabetes study or a lipid lowering study as examples. So one of the data points that we have is, where do patients want to hear about clinical trials? Now, there's some data that's generated through a nonprofit up in Boston called CISCRP, which is an abysmal acronym, but I'll try to say it out for you. The Center for Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation. Yeah, it wasn't really a lot of marketing guys behind that, but it's a great organization, actually. It's a nonprofit up in Boston that really makes a science out of studying how different stakeholders perceive clinical research and help to identify some of those barriers. So they did a study in 2013 of a couple of thousand patients around the world, both some who've been in studies and others that haven't, to understand their perceptions. And some of the data points that they had captured were around, where do patients want to hear about clinical trials and where are they actually hearing about clinical trials? The majority of patients, and it was over 50%, it was actually 54%, wanted to hear about clinical trials from their primary care physician. It's not surprising. You're talking about treatment options, care options. Kind of makes sense that you would look to that treating physician and say, help me out, talk to me about that. A similar, slightly lower number wanted to hear about clinical trials from their specialists. But in both cases, those were your number 1 and 2 answers from patients in terms of where they want to hear about clinical trials. And yet, only 20% said that their treating physician talked to them about clinical trials. Where are most patients finding them? Take a guess. On the internet. Where only a third of patients say they actually would have preferred to read about a clinical trial online, as compared to over half saying they want to hear about it from providers, they end up having to find it on the internet. Their treating physicians aren't talking to them about clinical trials. So that number of 20% came from CISGRIP, and then there was some data that also came out from the NCI that only 10 to 20% of physicians in the community were talking to their cancer patients. Not the oncologists, but more their treating physicians, their GPs, their primary care docs, talking to those patients about clinical trials. So when we think about all of these great tactics that people may have for trying to engage patients in clinical trials today, most of them end up going very much direct to patient, right? If they're using social media or Facebook or YouTube or TV and radio spots. And when you look at most of the trials that all of our companies are doing today, these patients are very rarely undiagnosed patient populations that we're studying. For the most part, the populations that we're looking to recruit in studies are patients who have some pathology and most often would be under the care of some physician. So if you hit a patient with an ad or you hit them with an impression on the web, what's the most likely thing they're going to do with that information? The same thing we tell them to do with every direct-to-consumer ad that we put out there. Talk to your doctor. So what's going to happen when they talk to their doctor? We're going to fall into this gap, into this void. And I'll share an anecdote. I heard from one patient. Pfizer, my company, is developing an antibody in this class of PCSK9 inhibitors, but this was from a patient that was in someone else's study, which likewise was enrolling close to 20,000 patients in their development program. And we were speaking with this one patient at a meeting and just asked, so how did you happen to find out about the study? And he said, I saw an ad. And we said, okay, so what'd you do next? Well, I went and go talk to my treating physician. And he said, okay, and what did he or she say? And the answer was very telling. It was, I wouldn't do that study if I were you, and if you do it, you're on your own. And so he went and joined the study, technically going against medical advice in order to be in one of our clinical trials of one of the companies that are in this room probably. So if we're going up against that type of barrier, we're never going to succeed, no matter how many great messages we go and put out there. So why is this a barrier, right? Why do the treating physicians in the community or elsewhere not engage around clinical trials? If you're a treating physician, we basically give you two options when it comes to clinical trials today. You can be an investigator in one of our studies, and that's not an easy ask. If you're familiar with the space, there's a lot of training. We're going to be sending monitors out. Monitors are like auditors from the IRS, right? So who's going to ask for that? It's going to disrupt your practice. And we know that the majority of physicians in this country that become an investigator in a study for the first time are one and done, because it's so disruptive, especially when you're getting started, because you still have a practice you're managing, and now you're going to try and layer a clinical trial on in the background. It's disruptive, and so the idea of saying, come join and be in my study, that's not so appealing. Okay, so what's the other option? Refer your patient to the investigator who's in my study. So play that out in your mind, if you will. You are a physician, you're treating this particular patient for high cholesterol, and you get a notice in the mail that says, here's a great study. In fact, we know from your EMR, here's 3 patients in your population that are eligible for the study. What are you going to do? Well, unless it's a patient that you don't want because you can't manage or you can't control, why would you send them away? How are you reimbursed and compensated as a physician today in a fee-for-service, procedure-based healthcare ecosystem, right? You send that patient to someone else to have them manage for their cholesterol in that person's study. You perceive the risk of loss of revenue, the risk of losing the patient, the risk of the patient having a bad experience outside of your control, and that coming back to haunt you. There's plenty of reasons for a patient to say no. My wife is a family physician at a very large medical group in Summit, New Jersey. And she has referred exactly 0 patients in her professional career into clinical trials, despite having to live with me and to listen to me complaining about this over and over. You'd think she would just refer 1, just so that I can stop saying that. But we're still married. And why is that? Well, in large part, she has practice. She manages, she treats these patients for a living. Why is she going to send them somewhere else if she has all these other fabulous options available to her, right? All the other ranges of treatment options that we have available. If you're not happy with your course of therapy, let's talk about it and we'll figure out another course. Why do we have to send you over to this other doctor's clinical trial? The IOM, the Institute of Medicine, did a report in around 2010 that also made some comments around this and really focused on that theme of financial incentives. So what are some of the things that we can do about this, this challenge? I'm just going to cheat for a second and see if I missed anything in my notes. Well, for one thing, I kind of made a little crack about we'll send the letter to a doctor's office and say, oh, by the way, we checked your EMR. There are tons of folks with very creative digital solutions to try to enhance recruitment. And a lot are looking at EMRs, right? Let's put in triggers and alerts, or let's scrape the data and try to take other actions. In all of those cases, it's all going to fall back on that exact same unmotivated individual, the treating physician. Because if I go to fill in the blank health system and we start poking around with de-identified data and we identify potentially eligible patients, or if I put an alert in the EMR that's going to pop something up the next time that patient is coming in, it's all the same bottleneck. So what are some of the things that we're doing right now that can help to remove some of that barrier? Well, I'll speak to 3 of them. Because someone once told me you should always do things in 3s when you're talking, right? Isn't that one of those coaching tips, right? So I'll speak to 3. The first one I'll speak to is around this category of how do we make it easier for physicians to participate? The second I'll speak to is a little more around how do we flip this dynamic and try to motivate and incentivize referrals? And the third will be a little more around, are there new roles we can create besides option A and option B that can be more appealing for the treating physician in the community? So the first one, as I mentioned, it's a drag to become an investigator in a study. There's a lot of work and rework that we create. It's definitely not an easy scenario. We do have a collaboration that I think was mentioned in the little blurb about this session called Transcelerate. People here heard of Transcelerate? A couple of nods, a couple of nays. So Transcelerate just celebrated this week their 3-year anniversary. So it was launched 3 years ago. The heads of R&D from 10 pharma companies came together to create a standalone nonprofit entity whose sole purpose was to help create efficiencies to shared problems in clinical development. So areas where we were all doing clever things, slightly different, where we didn't see it as competitive, and where in fact we were just creating more noise. Today, Transcelerate has 20 companies, pharma companies and biotech exclusively, as members, and about 14 initiatives that are underway. When we counted up the number of colleagues across these companies supporting those initiatives, there are about 500 to 600 colleagues across the industry that are working on these Transcelerate initiatives today. And one of the common themes to them has been removing some of the burden that we've created for physicians to participate as investigators in studies. I'll give 2 examples there. I might choose to go to Dr. Smith as an investigator because he or she participated in other studies, maybe with Janssen or Sanofi or Merck. So they're experienced, that's a good thing. And so what would be the first thing that I show up with for that experienced investigator who I chose based on all their recent work? Training on good clinical practices, GCP, which you would say, well, clearly this seasoned and experienced investigator understands GCP. That's why I chose them. We had no certification process in this country or in the clinical trial system. You can go to a rheumatologist and not have to ask for his or her CV and CME credits because somebody has credentialed them. They're board certified. Some other authority has done that. There is no such thing as a board certified or credentialed investigator. And so for every study, we all go out and re-credential them per our own criteria, which, not surprisingly, are pretty much identical from one company to the next with tiny, tiny little variation. And where each of those little variations creates noise and rework. We require your title to follow after your name versus before, or this has to be in lowercase versus upper, or blue or black, or whatever the silly little variations are that create that type of noise and busy work. And working in Transcelerate, we've now credentialed for GCP training upwards of over 100,000 investigators over the last 3 years through a process of mutual recognition to try to make it easier for people to participate in our studies. We've come up with a single website where you can create a single profile for yourself that can be accessed by all, so that you don't have to tell 20 different companies every time you have a new phone number, a new email address, a new MRI, a new employee working in your group. We created a single website where you can log in with a single identity to link back to the clinical trials you may have at Pfizer or Lilly or other companies, regardless of what CRO is supporting it, so that we can make life easier and try to remove all the little sticky notes from their screens. So that's nice. That tries to make it a little easier for the investigator. But what about my wife? She's not going to be an investigator in anyone's studies. So we have to try to find ways to stimulate those that are the treating physician in the community to be a little more motivated to participate. Well, one area that we've been very keen to develop is this topic around, well, when you think about healthcare reform today, they've been trying to address the same challenge, right? We have a fee-for-service healthcare system, so we get what we pay for. We follow the financial incentives, and so we have lots of services being performed because that's what generates money. So flash forward to where we are today. Healthcare in the United States using accountable care organizations, folks familiar with ACOs, meant to flip some financial incentives, more around outcomes rather than just procedures, more around working together in care teams. So it raises an interesting question, which has been, what are the positive impact, what are the positive takeaways to a health system, an integrated delivery network, a large medical group, an ACO, if you have more patients participating in research? And what we've started to do is generate data that supports the claim that higher rates of research participation inside of a health system is good for the health of the system. Better patient outcomes, lower cost of care, higher patient satisfaction. Triple aims. Things that then are good for a health system because they can get more financial incentives from ACOs and otherwise. So follow me down that. So today, my wife, not interested in referring, nobody's really encouraging or motivating her to refer. But what happens when the leadership of her health system, of her large medical group or ACO or what have you, all of a sudden cares that if we stimulate more research participation in that system, the system benefits. They can capture more revenue. They have better outcomes. They have higher patient satisfaction. And that's the signal that we've started to see generated even just last week with some folks from Wilmington Health and Eli Lilly and a small North Carolina-based research group called PMG. Likewise, starting to generate some of this data around high rates of research participation, good for a health system, and how can we use that to stimulate more referrals into trials from those treating physicians. I think some folks like Stephanie's group at Novartis have done some very clever work to likewise try to improve access for patients and stimulate greater research participation with the Signature trial, which is still requires an investigator, but makes it very easy and quick to activate those investigators into the study so that patients can participate where they are. The third area that I'll throw out to you is we have these two options for my wife today, right? Be an investigator in the study or refer your patient into the study. But what if there was an option 3 that lives somewhere in between? And let her do what she does every day, see the patient, generate data about the patient, right? You're doing blood work, maybe you're doing a physical exam or some other procedure in the office. You're capturing and recording the data from that encounter. What if we let her do what she does, get compensated for that, because I can pay her to do that work, but not have her be the investigator in the study? Because once she crosses that line and assumes the responsibility of being an investigator, now all of a sudden I'm going to send my audit team right out there and we're going to be right on her back. When we did a trial at Pfizer about 4 or 5 years ago called the remote study, we were pioneering an approach to enabling patients to participate entirely from home in a blinded randomized trial. They didn't have to go to clinics, they could stay at home. And one of the byproducts from that was we had a centralized investigator. They never physically saw, they only interacted with that investigator remote through the phone and through the web. But we used their treating physician locally to get some blood work done and to get a physical exam. And we cleared with IRBs and FDA that that physician is not an investigator in the study. They're almost the equivalent of an EKG machine. They're capturing data that we're sending off for someone else who is the proper investigator to make any decisions that involve the study or study participation. And so can we follow on that and enable my wife to now have an option C in there, so that just like when my son shows up at the doctor and says, I've got to get this physical filled out to participate on the team at school, or some other data has to be captured, we can have her do that, but compensate her in a fair way for that. Because I can't put bounties on patients. That's going to run into all sorts of ethical barriers. I can't just put out there that if you're a treating physician in the community, we'll drop you a check if you refer a patient. So we have to find some other ways to make this work given those constraints. So I'll stop there. I appreciate your feedback if that sparks some other ideas or thoughts or reaction, because it's a challenge that's pervasive across all of our organizations, and hopefully there are some shared solutions out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig.